Good morning, Ed here from Crystal Clear Aquatics. Back on site doing our first construction job for the season. This is a very nice pond that's been installed some years ago, and it's the usual story that sadly the liner has just come to the end of its life. 20 years plus of many happy years of pond ownership, but nothing lasts forever and it needs to be relined. Now this pond had been put in originally very well, so there's not really going to be any design tweaks to this. It's just going to be a simple job of removing all of the old plant matter and debris, lots of water lily rhizome, lots of iris roots and bits and pieces. Getting right round to the boundaries, the edges of the pond liner, removing the bricks and the rocks, putting in a new pond liner and then reassembling and rebuilding. So hopefully a relatively easy job. Hey. We've got a special guest. We've got David back on site. I've got a real labourer rather than Dan this time round. There's some lovely plants in here that we want to salvage. Marsh marigolds looking fantastic. This is just the right time of the year for these gorgeous spring blooming plants. And the irises are popping up. We've got some purple iris and then some lovely variegated purple iris here as well. I'm going to want to hang on to as much of that as possible. And this nondescript looking thing actually is a very exciting plant to me. I don't see these very often at all. This is something called butamus or flowering rush. There's lots of this popping up all over the place. It's quite a tall rush with a lovely spike of pink flowers. Really good for dragonflies and other pollinating insects. So I'm going to want to hang on to a lot of that. Yeah, beautiful. But as always with jobs like this initial stage, this is the messy part. Need to get all of this out. There's a few bigger rocks here. Pond liner comes right up behind these rockery stones, so they're all going to have to come out. The edge along most of this is lined with bricks, so the grass is going to get folded back, all of the bricks removed, so we can just access the full peripheral sort of boundaries of the pond liner. So this is the messy bit. How's your first day back there?
Yeah, very nice, thank you.
So as frequently happens, water lilies and irises, pond plants with these thick rhizomous roots, if left to their own devices, will just quickly take over and become this enormous kind of raft or island of root mass and foliage. I mean, this is probably about 30 centimetres thick of roots, and this has actually created kind of a false base, a false bottom to the pond, and the pond itself is an awful lot deeper than this. But this island of roots and foliage then creates a platform that other plants can start to grow into, and very quickly just the entire surface of a pond will be overtaken with pond plants. And to deal with something like this, it needs to be chopped up. Pruning saw, very useful. Obviously you've got to be very careful with the pond liner, but in this case, because we're replacing the liner, it doesn't matter if we were to go through it. But yeah, a little pruning saw, chopping it up into sections. If we were hanging on to this water lily, we'd be chopping it up into bits and then repotting on some of these successfully sort of sprouting areas of lily. Again, in this instance, this particular lily is a very large white variety, and it's too big for this pond. It's not in scale and it really takes over. So none of this lily is going to go back, and instead we'll replace it with a much smaller variety, which is going to be more appropriate for this size pond. As you were.
Thank you.
There's some really interesting varieties of plant here that I don't see very often in ponds. So this little grass here, Eleacaris, is a variety of hair grass. Will grow quite happily underwater and creates this lovely lush kind of green lawn, which is very nice. Obviously the butamus, the flowering rush, which I very rarely see. That's really nice to find. But also some lovely little varieties here of Sagittaria or arrowhead. It's a little bulb and it has these lovely kind of split leaves that come up almost like a a pointy water lily leaf, and then in the summer months when it flowers, it has these clusters of white blooms that are very nice. I don't often see that in a pond either, so that's great. I want to try and hang on to as much of this as possible. There's not an awful lot of life left in this pond, sadly. The damage to the pond liner, and we're discovering lots of holes and tears, meant there was very little water left in the pond, so any dragonfly larvae and obvious pond life has been picked off by the robins and other birds. But now we're removing a lot of the lily roots and starting to uncover the last of the water in the pond. We are getting lots of little newts. Now this is the smooth newt, one of our most common newts in the UK. We've got a lovely pair here, a nice female with a lovely kind of olivey skin, and then a lovely male, slightly darker but with these lovely spots on his belly, and he gets this nice sort of orange colour. These are quite often mistaken for great crested newts. The male smooth newt, particularly when he's in kind of breeding trim, develops a lovely sort of fiery red belly and throat, and will develop a, you know, almost a fin across the top of his back, a bit like the crest on the great crested newt, but they are unmistakably an awful lot smaller and definitely not the great crested, but they're lovely little things. There's another small wildlife pond in this garden, so anything like this we find we'll go and put in the other pond. Nice.
Lovely.
So already it's starting to look like the pond it once was, or certainly the excavation in the shell that it once was. And how much bigger it looks once you get rid of all of the plants and start to reveal all of the edging. So there's still a surprising amount of water and muck left underneath that false bottom of roots and vegetation, so an awful lot of mud and slurry to remove. Now this stuff is too good to waste. This is going to be deposited discreetly around the borders in the garden, little bits at a time. This alluvium or kind of muddy, silty water is a great organic sort of natural mulch to put on the borders. Once we've got rid of all of this and emptied the pond, we can give it a light jet wash just to make the liner a little bit more pleasant to handle, and then we can start to remove all of this. Now, it's quite tempting when you're relining a pond just to pop the liner on top of an old liner. You could do that, but if the old liner hadn't been installed particularly well and there's a lot of creases, those creases are then just going to transfer across to the new pond liner. So generally it's always better to remove the old lining, get right back down to the ground, do any prep work you need to do to the ground, tamp any bumps and lumps and bits and pieces, refleece it and then reline it. So that's the pond emptied, and we found an awful lot of newts. I don't know if you can see them in the bucket here, but there's got to be about 20 or 30 newts that we've salvaged that will go into the smaller pond. So I'm pleased that we found those. Come on in. So it's the all-important measure. Very important that we have a good measure and do this first before picking up a piece of pond liner. So we've exposed all of the edges, everything's been removed. Nice flexible measure. You could use a piece of string, fold it down over the contours of the pond, straighten it out and measure that. I'm using a nice flexible 30-metre tape measure which will do the job just fine. There are various formulas that you can use as well, rather than actually measuring the sort of physical excavation of the pond. You can do straight measurements over the top, so maximum length, maximum width and maximum depth, and then using a special formula you can work out a pond line of that size that way, but I do prefer to do a proper accurate measure, so I'm not having too much excess, too much wastage of pond liner. So we're going to measure the length of the pond and the width of the pond, following every contour as we go. Got my helpful assistant. We've already had a guess. I'm reckoning about, well, 6 by 5 I think it's going to be, or thereabouts, but we shall see. So we are talking about dun, dun, dun. Can't see, it's too muddy. 4 metres 80, so 5 metres. which is what we said. Or did I say 6?
You said 6.
I'll have to look on the footage and see. 5. So it's really important that you take the maximum dimensions, length and width. This kind of kidney-shaped pond, there's a couple of areas where it could be the widest point, so I'm going to take more than one reference point just to make sure we have got the widest point. So 4 metre would do it. So 5 by 4. Right. 5 by 4 metres. 20 square metres, if my maths is correct, and it's not one of my strong points. So then I can work out how much fleece I'm going to need as well. The old pond liner is going to be taken out. There's a few creases this side that I'm not happy with, but we're going to keep the old fleece in place, clean it up, and then we'll put new fleece on top of this. The fleece is there as a protective layer to prevent roots and sharp objects and bits and pieces from potentially damaging the waterproof aspect of the pond. So 20 square metres of pond fleece and 5 by 4 metre of pond liner. Now we've got to go and do some shopping. Good morning. It's day 2 on the job, and today is a glorious, fantastic day forecast, which I'm very much looking forward to. Nice to finally get a decent bit of sunshine and work on the tan a little bit. So today's target, we need to now tackle lining the pond, get the old pond liner out, get the fleece tidied up, make sure there are no stones and bits and pieces that have fallen on top of the fleece, re-fleece it with another layer of some new pond protective fleecing, and then put the new pond liner down on top. I've got my bowser here, which has been filling overnight with a load of water so that we can get the new pond liner put down nice and quickly with the weight of the water. And we can partially drain it and we can start to reassemble it. So having removed the pond liner, or the old pond liner, we're now just going around doing some final prep work before we can re-fleece and put this new protective layer of fleece down. I'm hanging on to the old fleece. This is in really good condition, and additional protection is really important for the pond liner. You can't really overdo the protection with the fleece. As I always stress, I think probably the pond fleece is more important than the quality of the pond liner. You can buy the best quality liner in the world, and if you haven't prepared the ground properly, you're still going to get problems with punctures and roots and various things. So it really pays to spend a little bit of time now on the ground prep work, all this unseen work, before you put the main pond liner in. Going around looking for little bits of stones, lots of loose soil that's fallen down on top of the old fleece. So we're just going to clean this all up and get rid of it before we then start to lay the new one. It's a gorgeous day. Feels very warm. Wishing I brought my vest with me now. Enjoying your first job back?
Yes, I am. Yeah. First one last October.
It's going to be nice to get the liner in though. See some water in here. I fear, however, I'm wearing my leaky waders. I didn't think of that this morning when I packed my van. Some of my seasoned viewers might notice something a little bit different about this pond fleece. That's the colour. Normally the fleece we use is a very, very bright white, which on sunny days like this can be horrendous. When you're sat sort of working inside an excavation like this, you end up with almost snow blindness and need to wear sunglasses. So this black fleece, although it's starting to get a little bit warm, it's much nicer to work with. That's the fleece down. Next job is to get the pond liner in, and that's a boots off job, working in my socks. Right, with the pond liner, this is a pre-bagged 5 metre by 4, and you would assume that it's been rolled up lengthways, the longest way, but that's not always the case depending on what size roller liner it's been cut from. So it's always worth, if you've got space, opening up the pond liner first, making sure you can orientate it and know which way round is the long point and the wide point before then offering it up into the excavation and starting to fill the hole. There's nothing worse than dropping in a really heavy roll of pond liner, rolling it out, to find that you've got to roll it all the way up again, take it out of the hole and spin it around 180 degrees to get it to fit. So we've put the pond liner in the excavation, and rather than try and get the liner to fit neatly now dry, instead we've opened it up, kind of stretched it out across the hole, making sure that the base of the liner is level and flat, but it's not actually in contact with the ground. And we can now start to put some water into the pond and let the weight of the water pull the liner down correctly into the excavation. And as long as we've got enough overlap all around the pond, this will seat down accurately, and we can start to neatly then sort of fold and pleat any of the creases that are evident. So we're letting the weight of the water now pull the liner in. Very dramatically and very quickly it starts to form the shape of the hole. And immediately you can start to see where the liner wants to crease naturally. And rather than having sort of, you know, quite nasty looking diagonal folds and various bits and pieces, it's nice to try and keep all of the folds reasonably kind of square, perpendicular, if that's the right word, to the pond. In the corners and the inside edges, you want to start to gather liner together and sort of fold it over, so you create this nice neat pleat like this, and then the weight of the water will hold that back and make it look nice and neat when it's filled. Normally I'll be doing this in a pair of shorts and Crocs or bare feet. It's a little bit too cold for that still, so I'm in my waders. I've checked the cleats on my boots and made sure there's no grit and stones and bits and pieces, just to safeguard the pond liner. Because the last thing I want to do is to put a hole in this new liner. Oh, the sun is shining. My new solar panel is rigged up, charging up my GoPro batteries, and that's working, which is great. Pond's full of water, time for a mid-morning snack. What have you got for your lunch today, David? Sandwiches? Very nice. Hungry work, this. Right, you can be the boss now, David. What's next? Next job?
Well, it's to work out where we start the cuts and then cutting it just to the height of the bricks. So the same height as that one over there, about 4 inches above the brick.
Okay, so that's what you want to do next. You want to cut the pond liner?
Yeah, otherwise you've got stone for me to wash.
Okay. So he's the boss, that's what we're going to do. We're going to cut the pond liner. So the pond's coming back together again nicely now. Initially I've just been focusing on putting all the bricks back around the pond. And this is a really good opportunity to show you a very easy way of edging a pond nicely. So if you've seen any of my pond builds before, you'll know that generally I like to have an internal shelf that I will build up stonework from the inside out. And that means that as the water level starts to drop, rather than revealing pond liner, you're just seeing stone, which aesthetically is a lot nicer. But also very importantly, that helps to protect what would normally be a visible strip of pond liner from harmful UV rays, which will really degrade and shorten the life of a pond liner. Now this is a very similar kind of affair, albeit simplified. Rather than using natural stone to create kind of a dry stone wall effect, my client who has built this pond and done a very good job of doing so has used some bricks, some engineering bricks, and just very simply laid them dry directly on top of the pond liner, albeit with some cushioning to protect this. It's very important you make sure that that shelf is as level as you can be, and of course it's much easier if you're bedding stonework and bricks on a bed of mortar. It's a lot easier then to make sure it's level. In this instance we're not doing so, it's just being laid dry and going back as it was originally. So I've been going around with a little mattock, just tamping, just to make sure that they're sort of bedded in nicely and nice and firm. And once those stones have gone down, you could leave it like that and keep it edged. It's very formal. But what my client has done, which is exactly what I would have done, is to then allow the grass to grow over the top of the stonework, keeping everything look very natural. The grass is going to wick a small amount of moisture from the pond, which is going to help to keep this nice and green. But rather than having the turf just folded directly into the pond, which a lot of people will do, these bricks are going to help to reduce contact between the grass and the pond water, and that means there's going to be a lot less wicking, a lot less moisture removed from the pond as a result. And then inside the pond, rather than seeing that edge of pond liner, you'll see the inner face of the bricks. So this works really well and it's incredibly simple. I mean, this has just taken me half an hour to replace the bricks, so nice and easy. Now, what I am going to do to add a little bit of extra security and to help stop these bricks from moving is to fill these bigger gaps here with some expanding foam. Originally this pond had been here for 25 years or so, and over the years the roots of the grass and the plants had grown in amongst these and had helped to stop these from moving. I'm going to give that a helping hand and use some of the Awaza expanding foam to do that job for me much quicker. So all the gaps between the bricks, well, that holds it nicely, have been filled with the Awaza expanding foam, the foam fix. Still not fully cured yet, so I'm going to leave it before I cut it and remove it, but that's just helping to really hold together those bricks nicely. It's good, isn't it? So Dave's going around now and he's just cleaning up a lot of the foam which has expanded out of the joints. It's had about an hour to dry, and he's just simply cutting it off and pushing down into the gaps what's left over. There you go, excellent. Nice and easy to do. And then once that's done, the grass has been folded back over the top of the brickwork, and suddenly it looks like a nice natural informal edge. I'm just going around starting to build up a structure of stone. Again, some of this is going to get foamed into place, and then a lot of that's just going to get concealed with soil and plants behind it to try and soften the edge. At the moment it looks just like a pile of stones, but once it's been planted up and softened, it'll look a little bit more natural. That's it, just like that. Looks like the pond's been there for ages. Very good. So now you start to get the idea of how useful having these bricks are, creating that nice sort of inner edge, concealing the pond liner, but preventing the soil, the roots from the turf here, from actually really sitting on top of the pond and wicking out and soaking out all of that pond moisture. Very good. So a lot of these rocks were originally just left loose. I'm going to just foam fix these into place just so they've got a little bit of strength behind them. Plenty of little nooks and crannies and areas where we can plant up and soften and conceal a lot of this stonework. Again, if you're not familiar with this, this is the Awaza foam fix, an expanding foam which is inert and totally safe to use in aquatic environments. It cures in about an hour or so, and it's very useful at holding together stones and loose materials that you want to fix into place semi-permanently. Can change. Oh, well, that's the end of a long day, but successful. And I keep threatening to buy myself a new pair of waders, and oh, I really should. Dave, I got a wet leg. Look at the state of that. Thank goodness it's a sunny day. If I've got any viewers, any subscribers that happen to manufacture waders and you want to sponsor me, please, by all means, I'll try out your gear because these leak all the time. Right, it's planting time, and for me this is always probably my favourite aspect of projects like this. I love getting my hands dirty and getting involved in planting on some of this sort of stuff. We've got some nice established specimens to pick some of the best bits from. Lovely clumps of this marsh marigold, Caltha palustris, nice early spring flowering plant, always the first signs of spring when the marigolds are in flower. We've got some lovely iris insata here, which is the Japanese purple iris, and one of my favourites, which is a bit harder to establish, is the insata variegata, or variegata, the variegated Japanese purple iris. This is beautiful. The contrast between the foliage and then the lovely purple flowers, really, really nice. So we're going to pot on a lot of this. We've got lots and lots of sections of the butamus, that flowering rush, which at the moment doesn't look particularly much to speak about, but when it's in flower, it's lovely. There's not many plants that look like this in the pond, and this is the only flowering rush. Lovely, lovely clusters of very, very bright pink flowers. So that's a really nice one, and not one I often come across. If I can find it. I know I'd salvaged a few. Here we go. a few bulbs of something called Sagittaria, or arrowhead. And this is a British native plant, little bulbs that end up developing these lovely kind of arrow-shaped leaves. Ends up, I suppose, about 18 inches, 1.5 foot in height. Clusters again of white flowers with a sort of a small orange centre. Again, not something that I come across very often, so I was pleased when I found these. Now planting, not using aquatic compost, just using a fine gravel. There's no fish in this pond, so a 10mm gravel or even a finer horticultural grit will be absolutely fine as a planting medium. Using traditional plastic pond baskets, because we're not using soil which is fine enough to fall through the grid. No need to line these, just gravel straight in, plant in, a layer of gravel over the top just to hold it into place. And the gravel will act as a nice sort of heavy ballast as well to make sure the plant is well anchored and isn't potentially going to fall over as the plant gets taller. These are what I would class as kind of small to medium sized baskets, absolutely fine for smaller irises and small to medium varieties of pond marginal plant. If we had some larger varieties of iris, yellow flag, the pseudochorus, which gets very tall, or other varieties of plant that get really tall, something like this isn't going to be big enough, and as soon as the plant is established, gust of wind is going to blow it over. So they need to go into much larger baskets, but they'll be fine for this sort of plant. Right. Try not to slice through my waders. Mind you, they're already leaking, aren't they? Now this gravel is very dusty and it will need a good rinse. But the easiest way to do that is once you've got the plant planted up, is to then get the hose out and give the pot a really good soaking, and all that dust and mucky water will just come out through the sides. When the water starts to run clear, that's good enough. You can then pop it in the pond. So this marigold we can comfortably split. Here we go, just using my little trusty pruning saw or folding saw. Very, very useful for this kind of thing. Now the marigold, if you really wanted to, a clump like this, you could divide up into tens of plants. Each little kind of cluster can be separated like this. And if you wanted to, you could pop that on and that would establish into one plant, but it would take a few years to end up developing this nice dense clump. So I'm not going to separate them too much. I'll half that, and this one I'll probably half as well. Now if we had some fish in the pond, some larger goldfish or shabunkians, something of that family, I'd probably finish this off with a slightly larger dressing of a 20mm gravel, just a very, very fine layer, because a big goldfish would still be able to rummage around in this basket, and very quickly a lot of this gravel would end up in the bottom of the pond. But that's one plant, really simple. Now, let's see if we can do some of the irises. I love this. Much, much slower to establish. In fact, I reckon this one, let's put these in a contour and get a nice big basket of it. A lot of these plants over the years had kind of grown into one another, and I want to try and make sure that we separate them so that we've got clear definition between the different varieties of plants. Okay, I reckon that will be sufficient for the basket. Right, I've got a lot to work with here. I shall work my way through and you'll see the finished result. So we've got a nice mix of plants here, potted on, some of the variegated iris, a few pots of the Japanese purple iris, a couple of pots of the butamus, the flowering rush, a nice basket full of the Sagittaria, the arrowhead, and some marsh marigolds. Probably enough for the pond. I'm going to position them in the pond now and see what that looks like.
If it looks a little bit bare, we've still got some more plant that I can chop up and plant on, but I reckon this is probably going to be a good quantity. The pots have all been well watered to make sure that the dust and the muck from the gravel has come out, so we're not going to stir up the pond and make it too cloudy. It's time to put them in the pond. Now these shells have been dug down perfectly, just to the right depth by Howard when this pond was dug originally in the 90s. The shelf is about 30 centimetres a foot down, and that means when the pond is filled to the top, we've got about 4 or 5 inches of water most above the baskets. Cosmetically that's nice, that means that the baskets are not emerging out of the water like this, which never looks very nice, so they're going to be concealed underwater, but it means that we haven't got too much water above the crowns of the plants, which will prevent some varieties of pond plant from growing. Now if it was predominantly bog plants that I was planting, then 4 inches of water above the pot would be too much. They would need to be lifted so that the water's surface is at the surface or fractionally lower. But for the varieties of plants we've got here, this depth is perfect. It's really important when you're designing a pond and digging out shelving to make sure that the shelving is level or even sloping slightly back to the edges of the pond so that you've got a nice stable platform to balance baskets if that's how you're going to plant. And also make sure that the shelf is broad enough. There's nothing worse than having a really, really thin shelf and the plants end up in the bottom of the pond. So it's nice to finally see the pond filled up. This is the first time I've seen it up to its maximum level. And the final job to do today is to introduce a little bit of blanket answer to help prevent the inevitable blanket weed which is going to grow. There's a lot of new tap water in here which is going to introduce a lot of nutrients. And that in turn, with the sunlight, if we get any, is going to cause an algae bloom. So to try and nip that in the bud, a good dose of blanket answer is going to help. Now this makes the pond very cloudy for a couple of days, but it'll settle and clear. It doesn't cause any harm. Right, that's going to be it for this job. It's going to take the rest of this season to really establish the plants, of which there's a lot in here, which is good. So a lot of plants to get the pond established. Will take a little while for the roots to establish and bind up into the baskets properly. But this time next year, the pond will look very different. So I shall look forward to coming back and seeing how it's establishing. I hope you found this useful. As ever, thank you very much for watching. I'm Ed from Crystal Clear Aquatics, and he's Dave behind the camera.
Good afternoon.
And we'll see you in the next pond.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much for watching. Says recording, red light flashing. Take one. So it's planting time. For me, this is always probably the most fun aspect of these kind of projects because I really love getting involved in the plants and putting it back into the pond. We've got a nice selection of some established plants here to pick from. We've got some lovely marsh marigold. And I've forgotten the Latin name of marsh marigold. That's ridiculous. Caltha, let's start again.